People were burning wood to stay warm in the valley because it was cold. A 15-year-old youngster who didn't have a home sat in his weird round cabin, which was 68 degrees. They teased him, but in the end, winter made the choice. Let's get started. It was in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina in October 1947. In Madison County, every builder was erecting the same rectangular cottages that their fathers and grandfathers had built. But 15-year-old Elias Crowley was making something that made everyone in the valley wonder if he was crazy. The child who was thrown out of his stepfather's house with only a canvas bag and $40 in crumpled bills was building a round dwelling. There were no corners or right angles. The only thing that stood out was a single, curved wall that rose from a stone base on a windy hill where no one wanted to reside. When kids spotted another kid creating a house out of corn at Marshall's feed store, they laughed. Let him stay out in the cold for 2 months until he dies and crawls back to town. Elias Crowley, on the other hand, had no plans to crawl anywhere. He had spent 3 years watching, listening to, and remembering all his Cherokee grandmother had taught him before she died. She had told him that the square dwellings of white people were losing a war with nature. If you want to know what happened when the worst winter in 20 years hit that strange round cabin, sign up for this show and tell me where you're watching from in the comments, because the data from that winter shut up every man who had made fun of Elias Crowley. Elias had learned early on that family was not always defined by blood, and blood did not always signify family. His mother died while giving birth to him in the back bedroom of a shotgun house in Asheville. His father, Samuel Crowley, a forestry worker, had nurtured him alone for the first 8 years of his life, training him to read the forest, comprehend wood and weather, and revere the mountains that supplied all they wanted. Samuel's mother, a Cherokee named Ada, who had married a white trader against her family's wishes, lived with them in a modest house she had built herself. Ada was the one who taught Elias the old ways, the information that her people had accumulated over many centuries of living in these mountains. She depicted houses that breathed with the wind rather than against it, shapes that recognized the cycle of life, and building techniques that worked with the ground rather than against it. Elias took it all with the frenzied longing of a child who understood that this knowledge could one day save his life. Samuel Crowley perished in a logging accident when Elias was 11 years old. A white oak that should have fallen straight twisted on its stump and came down improperly, crushing him before he could react. Ada followed her son to death 6 months later. Her heart was devastated, and her will to continue was gone. Elias found himself alone, an orphan with Cherokee lineage in a world that didn't value either circumstance. The county put him with his mother's sister and her husband, Vernon Cross, who owned a small farm near Marshall. Vernon wasn't cruel in clear ways. He didn't beat, starve, or keep Elias in closets. Vernon's actions were easier but probably more harmful. He simply communicated, by 1,000 subtle cuts of indifference and disdain, that Elias was a burden to be borne, not a kid to be loved. For 4 years, Elias toiled on the farm, went to school when labor allowed, and kept his head down. He slept in a drafty chamber above the barn, ate after the family had dined, and learned to be invisible. He was also observing. He noted how Vernon's rectangular farmhouse leaked heat from every point, how the family burnt up cord after cord of firewood each winter while staying crouched around the stove in thick garments. He watched how the wind located every location where walls intersected at right angles. Snow drifted on the flat faces, building up until it barred windows and doorways. He saw and remembered what his granny had taught him, and he comprehended why she continuously shook her head when she saw the white men's dwellings. The end happened 3 weeks after Elias turned 15. Vernon had concluded that the child was old enough to be useful in more beneficial ways. A forestry firm in Tennessee was hiring young men for risky work at wages given directly to Vernon, Elias' legal guardian. Elias would drop out of school, move to a logging camp, and send money home until he achieved the age of 18. It wasn't a chat, there was a message. Elias left that night. He took his grandmother's diary, a hand-drawn collection of building techniques and natural wisdom collected over 60 years. He took the $40 he had earned from odd jobs over 4 years, along with coins and crumpled bills buried in a coffee can beneath the barn floor. He brought a canvas bag, a hunting knife, a wool blanket, and the clothes on his back. He walked north into the mountains, to terrain so steep and inaccessible that no one had cared to claim it, and he didn't look back. The ridge Elias picked was around 4,000 feet high, a wind-swept shoulder of granite and thin soil that more sensible inhabitants had passed over for years. The site had legally belonged to a forestry business, which had chopped it naked in the 1920s, before leaving it when the Depression made even inexpensive land worthless. Nobody had made a claim in 20 years. Nobody wanted to. The wind blew ceaselessly up there, stealing heat from whatever was in its path. The soil was thin and rocky, barely supporting the scrubby second-growth forest that had begun to retake the logged hills. The next neighbor lived 3 miles down the mountain, and the next town was 7 miles away over a road that became inaccessible with the first heavy snowstorm. Every practical element worked against building there, but Elias sensed something peculiar. He observed a south-facing slope that gets winter sun from daybreak until mid-afternoon. He observed a spring flowing up from a rock face 50 yards above where he intended to construct, delivering year-round water transported by gravity without the need for a pump. He saw granite outcroppings that may be used as building stone without the necessity for mining. He observed stands of young oak and hickory that the loggers had left behind, perfect for cutting and curing. Most notably, he noted a little natural clearing where the wind patterns produced a relative calm zone, where the constant mountain gusts divided around a rock formation and reconnected downslope, leaving a pocket of still air in between. His grandma had taught him to read wind in the same way that others read books. She had explained how our ancestors chose building locations not for ease or beauty, but for the invisible patterns of air, water, and sun that decided whether a dwelling thrived or simply endured. Elias stayed in that clearing for 2 weeks, simply watching. He kept notes on where the sun rose and set, as well as how its angle varied from fall to winter. He watched wind patterns at different times of day, noting with stones where gusts were sharpest and stillness prevailed. He analyzed the drainage patterns after a major storm, identifying where the water flowed and where it pooled. He wasn't building a house. He was learning about a place. The foundation came first, defining the principle that would drive everything Elias constructed. While rectangular foundations demanded exact right angles, meticulous measurement, and corners that concentrated strain at specific points, Elias constructed a circular foundation that distributed weight equally across its complete perimeter. He dug an 18-inch deep pit and filled it with granite outcropping stones, gluing them together without cement in the old way his grandma explained. The circle measured 24 feet in diameter, which was larger than most people imagined a round construction could be, but Elias had carefully evaluated the inner space. A 24-feet circle gave about 450 square feet of floor surface, which is nearly equal to a rectangular cabin spanning 20 by 23 feet. However, unlike a rectangular hut, every square foot of that space would be utilized. There are no freezing air-accumulating corners, no dead zones where furniture cannot fit correctly, and no unused space where walls meet at angles that serve building ease rather than living comfort. The walls progressively rose during October and November. Elias adopted a method his grandmother termed stack wall or cordwood construction. However, he made major alterations based on her notes. He cut logs to uniform lengths of 16 inches, the thickness of his walls, and stacked them like kindling, end grain facing in and out. Between each layer, he added a mortar of clay, sand, lime, and sawdust in the exact amounts stated in his grandmother's journal. The crucial discovery was the last grain. Wood transmits heat significantly more efficiently along its length than across its grain. Elias developed a wall that excelled typical log building in terms of heat transfer resistance by arranging the logs with their ends toward the inside and exterior. The sawdust and the mortar gave insulation. The wall's thickness of 16 full inches supplied thermal mass, absorbing heat during the day and gradually releasing it at night. However, the circular shape was what made the system genuinely efficient. A rectangular cabin with 450 square feet of floor space needs roughly 85 linear feet of external wall. Elias' round cabin with the same floor room needed only 75 linear feet of wall. That meant 12% less surface area exposed to the cold, 12% less opportunity for heat to escape, and 12% less material needed for construction. The math was straightforward. The repercussions were significant. The unique construction project immediately traveled throughout Madison County. Like country gossip, bombers and loggers found excuses to ride up the mountain, presumably inspecting wood or hunting boundaries, only to discover the crazed Crowley youngster erecting a roundhouse on a ridge where nothing could survive. Earl Hutchkins, who ran the feed business and considered himself an expert in all practical affairs, made the visit in late October. He brought his son Roy and two other men, who stood at the edge of Elias' clearing, arms crossed and features arranged in knowing delight. "Boy, what in the name of common sense are you building?" Earl asked. Elias sat on the log piece he was putting in place and wiped his hands on his pants. "A house, sir." "That is not a house. A house has sides, appropriate walls, and a roof peak that sheds snow." Earl shakes his head. "That is a silo." "Are you going to store grain yourself?" The other men laughed. Roy Hutchkins, who was 17 and had never built anything more than a fence, laughed the hardest. Elias stayed composed, his grandmother's patience reflected in his measured reaction. "Sir, corners are weak places. That is where cold comes in and heat escapes. A circle contains no weak portions," Earl said. "A circle makes no sense. How will you arrange furniture against a curved wall? How do you plan to frame windows in a round structure? How are you going to put a roof on that?" These were valid questions, and Elias answered reasonably. Furniture could be constructed to fit curves or positioned away from walls. Windows could be framed with angled cuts to meet the wall's curve. The roof would be a shallow cone supported by a central pillar and radiating rafters, making it faster to build and substantially more wind-resistant than a peaked roof. Earl listened with the patronizing focus of a man who has already made his choice. When Elias finished talking, Earl smiled like he was ready to provide information to a fool. "Son, I've been living in these woods for 47 years. My father lived here before me, as did his father before him. We've been building buildings in the same way for generations because it works." He indicated to the circular walls rising from their stone base. "You're 15 years old. You have no money, no aid, and no experience. And you're trying to reinvent something that doesn't require it." He turned to go and halted. "The first severe winter will teach you lessons that your grandmother's fairy stories could not. Come meet me in town when you're ready to build something proper. If you live long enough, I'll help you find honest work." The men rode away, their laughter carrying back up the slope long after they disappeared into the trees. Elias returned to his work. The walls would not build themselves, and winter was coming. November brought the first serious cold, temperatures dropping into the 20s at night, and Elias pushed himself to complete the structure before conditions made construction impossible. The roof went up in a single week of frantic labor. A cone of radiating rafters meeting at a central post, covered with overlapping wooden shingles he had split from oak blocks during the warmer months. The pitch was shallow, only 15, which conventional wisdom said was too flat to shed snow. But Elias knew something conventional wisdom had forgotten. A shallow pitched roof on a circular structure does not accumulate snow the way a peaked roof does. Wind flowing over the curved walls created a consistent uplift pattern that swept the roof surface clean. Snow that landed was lifted and scattered rather than piling in drifts. The circular shape had no valleys, no corners, no places where snow could accumulate and stress the structure. Elias had watched his grandmother's small round cabin on his father's property shed snow that buried the rectangular farmhouse next door, and he trusted what he had seen over what others assumed. The door faced southeast, positioned to catch morning sun while avoiding the prevailing northwest winds. A single window, larger than most cabins featured, faced due south to maximize passive solar gain during winter months. Elias framed it with a deep sill that would allow sunlight to penetrate far into the interior. When the sun sat low on the horizon, a small wood stove occupied the center of the single room, its chimney rising through the apex of the conical roof. The central placement was deliberate. Heat from the stove would radiate in all directions equally, warming every part of the circular space. In a rectangular cabin, a corner stove created hot and cold zones. Areas near the fire that roasted while areas in distant corners froze. Elias's central stove eliminated this problem. The walls themselves became part of the heating system. The 16-in of cordwood construction with its end grain orientation and insulated mortars absorbed heat from the stove during active burning and released it slowly for hours afterward. The circular shape meant the entire wall surface participated equally in this thermal exchange. No corner sections cooling faster than flat sections. No thermal bridging where walls met at angles. Just a continuous curved surface moderating temperature throughout the space. Elias moved into the completed cabin on November 28, 1947. He had a bed built from local wood, a table and chair he had constructed himself, shelves holding the provisions he had accumulated through months of work and trade, and his grandmother's journal sitting in a place of honor near the window. The cabin was spare but complete. Outside, the temperature had dropped to 18. Inside, with a small fire burning in the central stove, Elias recorded a reading of 6. He made this notation in the journal, the first of many temperature records he would keep through the winter. The data he accumulated would eventually silence everyone who had called him a fool. December arrived with a brutality that veterans of Madison County said they had not seen in 20 years. A cold front descended from Canada during the first week, dropping temperatures below zero and keeping them there for 9 consecutive days. Snow fell in quantities that blocked roads, collapsed outbuildings, and trapped families in their homes. The county recorded 3 deaths from exposure, and 2 more from fires started by desperate attempts to keep warm. Earl Hutchkins burned through his entire winter wood supply by January 15th, and had to purchase more at 3 times the autumn price. His rectangular farmhouse, despite its 2 fireplaces and potbelly stove, could not maintain 50 when temperatures outside dropped below -5. The family slept in the kitchen, the only room that stayed bearably warm, huddling under every blanket they owned, while the rest of the house froze. His son Roy developed frostbite on 2 toes after the fire died during one particularly cold night. Throughout the county, the story repeated itself. Families burned more wood than they had ever burned before, and still could not keep warm. The snow drifted against flat walls until it blocked windows and doors, requiring hours of shoveling to maintain access. Wind found every corner joint, every gap where walls met at right angles, every weak point in conventional construction. Houses that had seemed adequate for decades revealed themselves as barely sufficient shelters, tolerable in normal winters, but overwhelmed by genuine cold. 3 miles down the mountain from Elias Crowley's ridge, a farmer named Clement Hardin rode his mule through snowdrifts to check on the boy everyone assumed had died weeks ago. Clement had argued against the Mockery at Earl's feed store, though not loudly enough to matter. He was a quiet man who had learned that being right brought less satisfaction than simply being left alone. Still, the thought of a 15-year-old boy frozen to death in a foolish round cabin troubled his sleep, and he decided to know for certain one way or another. What Clement found on that ridge defied everything he thought he understood about winter construction and survival. The round cabin sat in its clearing like something from another world, its curved walls shedding the pale winter sunlight, its shallow roof swept clean of snow by the constant wind that scoured everything else on the ridge. No drifts had accumulated against the walls. No ice dams had formed along the roofline. The structure looked almost warm, if a building could look warm, settled into its site, as if it had grown there rather than been built. Smoke rose from the central chimney in a thin, steady stream that suggested efficient burning rather than desperate consumption. Clement dismounted and approached the door, his breath fogging in air that bit exposed skin within seconds. He knocked, and a moment later, Elias Crowley opened the door. The boy was wearing a light wool shirt, no coat, no visible shivering. Behind him, Clement could see the cabin interior glowing with warmth, the central stove radiating heat that seemed to fill every inch of the curved space. "Mr. Hardin," Elias said, genuine surprise in his voice. "Come in, sir. You must be frozen." Clement stepped inside and stopped. The warmth hit him like a physical force, not the searing blast of a roaring fire, but a deep, even heat that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The curved walls radiated warmth. The floor, made of fitted stone, held residual heat from the stove. The air itself felt different, still and comfortable in a way Clement had never experienced in any cabin he had entered during winter. "What temperature is it in here?" Clement managed to ask. 68, Elias replied. "I checked it an hour ago." His own farmhouse, with 2 fireplaces burning constantly, could barely maintain 45 in this cold. And this boy, this 15-year-old orphan everyone had mocked, was living in shirt sleeves. "How much wood are you burning?" Elias walked to the stove and opened the door. Inside, a modest fire consumed 2 small logs. "I fire it twice a day, morning and evening. Maybe 30 pounds of wood total." 30 pounds. Clement burned that much every 3 hours during cold snaps like this. His family went through nearly a cord per week in severe weather, and they were still cold. Elias was using perhaps a quarter of that amount, and maintaining temperatures 20 higher. "The walls," Clement said slowly, looking at the curved surface of cordwood and mortar. "They hold the heat. They store it," Elias corrected gently. "The thermal mass absorbs energy from the stove and releases it slowly for hours. The circular shape means all the wall surface participates equally. No corners to create cold spots or leak heat." He placed his hand on the wall. "Feel it. Still warm from this morning's fire." Clement touched the wall. It was warm, genuinely warm, like sun-heated stone in summer. He had never felt anything like it in winter, not in 43 years of living in these mountains. Clement Hardin rode down from that ridge a changed man. He stopped at every farm along the way, telling anyone who would listen what he had seen. A round cabin maintaining nearly 70 in below-zero weather. A boy burning a quarter of the wood everyone else used and staying twice as warm. Construction techniques that turned everything they knew about building upside down. At first, people dismissed him the way they had dismissed Elias. Clement was known as a quiet, fanciful man, prone to exaggeration when he got excited. A round cabin that stayed warm with no fire. Obviously impossible. Obviously a story that had grown in the telling. But the cold continued, and the suffering mounted. And eventually curiosity overcame skepticism. Earl Hutchins himself made the journey in late January, driven by desperation rather than humility. His family had been sick for weeks, unable to get warm, burning through money and wood at rates that would bankrupt them before spring. If the Whitfield boy had found something that worked, Earl needed to know about it, even if it meant admitting he had been wrong. Earl did not apologize for his earlier mockery. He was not that kind of man. He showed Earl his records, the daily temperature readings he had maintained since moving in. Outside temperatures ranging from -12 to 41, inside temperatures never falling below 62, never requiring more than 2 daily firings of the small central stove. Wood consumption roughly 1/3 of what comparable rectangular cabins used, documented and measured over nearly 2 months of the hardest winter anyone could remember. "I've spent more on firewood this winter than I usually spend in 3 years." He looked at Elias with eyes that had finally learned something about humility. "Would you teach me how to build one of these?" Elias Crowley taught Earl Hutchins, and Earl, despite his flaws, taught others. By spring of 1948, 3 round cabins were under construction in Madison County. Circular shape to minimize heat loss. Cordwood construction with end-grain orientation, central heating to eliminate cold zones, thermal mass to store and release warmth slowly. Each one demonstrating that ancient wisdom and practical science were not opposites but partners. The original round cabin on the windswept ridge still stands today. Elias Crowley lived in it for 62 years, raising a family, weathering winters that would have killed him in any conventional structure, proving every single day that his grandmother's knowledge had been worth preserving. He died in 2009 at the age of 77, surrounded by children and grandchildren who had grown up understanding that the old ways were not primitive, but profound. The winter of 1947-48 did not just test Elias Crowley's round cabin, it tested an assumption that had gone unchallenged for generations. The assumption that the way things had always been done was the way things should continue to be done. Elias proved that assumption wrong, not with theory, not with argument, but with a thermometer and a woodpile. And the simple fact of his survival, the principles he applied were not new. They were ancient, developed by indigenous peoples over thousands of years of living in harmony with their environment rather than in conflict with it. Circular structures are stronger than rectangular ones of equivalent materials. They resist wind and seismic forces more effectively. They enclose more space with less wall area. They distribute stress evenly rather than concentrating it at corner joints. They create natural air circulation patterns that improve comfort and reduce energy consumption. Every advantage Elias claimed for his round cabin has been validated by scientific study. The thermal mass principle he employed, storing heat in dense materials for slow-release forms, the basis of passive solar design used in energy-efficient buildings worldwide. What Elias understood, what his grandmother understood, what indigenous builders have understood for millennia, is that efficiency and simplicity often travel together. Elias Crowley was 15 years old, homeless, penniless, and alone. Everyone who should have helped him had either died or abandoned him. Every expert in his community told him he was wrong. He built his round cabin anyway, and he was right. And the people who mocked him eventually came to learn from him. That is not just a story about construction. That is a story about the courage to trust your own understanding when everyone around you insists you are foolish. If this story moved you, if it made you reconsider what you thought you knew about building survival or the wisdom of those who came before us, hit subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things by questioning assumptions everyone else took for granted.